So previously we saw how we could use the copy wizard, the copy data wizard in Azure Data Factory to copy data from one place to the other. And under the covers, what that actually did was create a pipeline with all the necessary linked services and data sets that it needed to do the work to have that copy action to move the data from one place to the other. So now we're going to look at how we can create a pipeline from scratch to do the same job and what that would look like. So here I am in the Azure portal. There's a couple of ways that we can create pipelines. One of the ways we can do it is in the portal. And you can see I'm on the blade for my Azure Data Factory. And we'll go into this author and deploy section here. And you can see that what I get is this blade here with linked services, data sets, pipelines, data gateways, and so on. So all the different components that I might want to create. And if I expand my linked services, I can actually see that it's already got a couple of linked services here that were created by the wizard. And if I take a look at that blob store, I can see that that linked service is defined using this JSON syntax to define what that looks like. And that's my Azure storage linked service for where the data was, my source of the data. And the important thing here is the connection string in here and the properties of that Azure storage type. Its default endpoint protocol is HTTPS. The account name is gstore12345. You might remember that was the name of my storage account. And the account key that's used to access that is asterisked out for security, but that's the secure access key for that storage account. And similarly, if I take a look at the SQL database linked service, I've got the same types of information for that SQL database that was the destination. I can see that there's a data source is gsql12345.database.windows.net. That's my server. The initial catalog was DataDB. That was the database. And I can see all sorts of other information in there as well, including the username and password, again, asterisked out for security. So it's defined the linked services. The wizard itself actually doesn't generate data sets, so I don't have any data sets there, but I do have the pipeline that was created by the wizard. And I can see, again, that's a JSON document that describes the pipeline, including the description that I gave when I run through the wizard, and the activities within that pipeline. In this case, there's only one activity. It's a copy activity that copies from a blob source to a SQL sync. And if I scroll through here, you can see that actually we've got a whole bunch of JSON information describing that pipeline. And I've got the data sets. The reason they don't appear separately over here is they're actually described in line in the pipeline description. So they only exist within that pipeline. There's my input of the tdate and amount columns. And it's getting that from that linked service, from my blob store linked service. And similarly, I've got the output, which is my Azure SQL database table with tdate and amount. And I can see that that's a table in my linked service called SQL database, and the table is called DBO transactions. So you can work your way through the JSON in these documents and figure out what that's actually describing. Now, what I could do is from here, I could go ahead and I could create a new data store here. I could go ahead and create a new data store for Azure Storage, for example, and I get some JSON here that I could just edit manually in the interface here. I'll just discard that one. I could also go ahead and create, if I click on more here, I can create new data sets to describe different types of data sets. So I could describe one from my blob storage. I could describe the data set for that file that I want to export. Again, I'll just discard that. And I can also create pipelines in here as well. And again, I get this default JSON that I just go and edit. And there's documentation on the JSON that you need to create to create these pipelines. And once you've created your necessary components, your data sets, your pipelines, and your data sources, your linked services, you can go ahead and deploy and run those pipelines from right here within the browser. And that's what you'll be doing in the labs. Now, the other way that you can do this is in Visual Studio. And in Visual Studio, you can see I've got my Visual Studio project up and running here. I've created a project, and there's actually a template. If I just go in and show you this, if I go and add a new project here, there is a template here called Data Factory. There's an empty Data Factory project, which you can create if you've installed the Azure tools for Visual Studio. So I've already gone and done that, and I can see that I can connect in my Cloud Explorer. I can connect to my Azure subscription. I can see my data factories, and I can see the data sets, linked services, and pipelines, all that stuff that we just saw in the browser I can see here as well. And all I've done so far is I've gone into my linked services and I have added the blob store and the SQL database linked services to this project. So I've literally just copied the JSON across and I've edited them to add in the necessary key and password. So you can actually see there's the blob store, and there's the JSON that describes that blob store. So the other thing I need to do now that I've got those two linked services in place, I need to define the data set for the source data and for the destination data. And you do that in this folder called tables here. So here's what the source data looks like. We'll just open that up. And I've got this JSON document that says I've got a thing called transactions-txt. The properties of that include its structure, which is a column called name, a column with the name tdate and the type date time, and a column with the name amount with the type decimal. So that's the source columns in my source data. It's an Azure blob type of table, so or type of data set. The linked service where I get to that blob is my blob store linked service. So that's the one here that connects to my Azure storage account. The folder path where I'll find that is in the ADF-data container in the data folder. And within that, I'm going to read all of the different files. It's text format, it's comma delimited, and the first row contains the header. So it's fairly self-explanatory. I know it looks complicated in this JSON, but when you break it down, it actually kind of makes sense. You can see what's going on. It's an external data source. In other words, this data source isn't controlled by ADF. I can add files to that independently of ADF. It's not purely managed by ADF pipelines. And the availability here is just, I'm basically telling it that I intend to update that every 15 minutes. I'm going to add a new file there every 15 minutes. So when I schedule a job, it's going to look for a new file there every 15 minutes. I've also got a data set for my transactions table in my database, similar sort of thing. JSON document that gives it a name, dbo-transactions. It's an Azure SQL table. It's in the SQL-database linked service. Here's the structure of that table. The table name itself is dbo.transactions. And again, the availability of how often I'm expecting to update that. And this availability, when I schedule this job to run, as we'll see later on, this availability of the destination is going to determine how frequently the action actually runs. So I've taken all of that, and then I've defined a pipeline here. And if I look at the pipeline, interestingly, in the editor here, I get a visualization of that. You can see that it's a pipeline that consists of a copy trans data action that copies from my transactions text data set to my DBO transactions data set as the destination. I just close all that up. You can see the JSON that describes that. It has a pipeline called copy trans with an activity called copy that's going to copy from a blob source, and it's going to write to a SQL sync. And we're going to do that using a thing called a tabular translator, and the columns in that table that we're going to move across are tdate and amount, tdate to tdate, amount to amount. So that's the source and destination column names. The input is transaction.txt. So instead of describing the data set in line here, I'm just pointing it to that data set file, transactions.txt. And the same with the output, that's my DBO transactions. The name of that action is copy trans data. And the pipeline mode, in this case, I'm just going to run it one time. I'm not scheduling it to run multiple times. So that describes my pipeline. Now, before I go ahead and deploy this, I just want to show that there's nothing up my sleeve. If I go and have a look in that database here, I've actually truncated that table now. So if I view the data in my DBO transactions table, you can see that actually it's not got any data in it. I've completely emptied that table there. So we'll go ahead and we'll go and deploy all of these different elements that we've got here, our linked services, our data sets, and our pipeline. We'll deploy all those to our Azure Data Factory. So we'll go ahead and publish. And I'll select my existing Azure Data Factory rather than create a new one. Go and click Next. I'm not going to specify any particular configuration. We're just going to go ahead and deploy this. Notice it lists the existing items that are already in my data factory. So there's a pipeline called Copy Wizard. I could choose to remove that if I wanted to, but I'm not going to do that. We'll just go ahead and run this and finish the wizard. And what that's going to do is it's going to take all of those individual elements of my my solution, the pipeline itself, plus the data sets that define the different data source and destination, and the linked services that define whereabouts those sources and destinations are actually stored. And it's going to go and upload all of those, and it's going to run that pipeline. Now, the pipeline was configured to just run once only. It's not a scheduled pipeline. So off it's going to go, and it's going to start running that pipeline. So we'll just finish off out of here. And we'll go back to the browser. And I've still got my JSON for my copy wizard pipeline open here. So we'll just close that. And I can see in my blade for my Azure Data Factory, I've got some pipelines. So if I have a look at the pipelines, I can see there's my copy trans pipeline that I've just deployed, and that is running. We're just going to have a look at that and take a look at the status. It takes a little while to load. And I can see that I'm copying from transactions to DBO transactions. It's actually in progress at the moment. Now, I specified that it would be 15 minutes before the data was ready, so you might have to wait for a little while, or if you get impatient, you can use this run button to go and run that. And I can see that it's running that action, so that activity rather, so that's running. It's not actually completed yet. And if I go and close these down, I can also, from my blade here for the Azure Data Factory, take a look at my data sets. So if I take a look at the transactions TXT data set, I can see that that's ready. So we've actually got the data ready to be copied up. And if I have a look at my DBO transactions, that's in progress. So we're currently loading that table in my SQL database. So we'll just wait for that to complete. And I can look and I can see that it has succeeded. So if I now go back to Visual Studio and go and refresh that table here, here's my transactions table, so we'll just refresh that. And sure enough, there's the data being copied across by my pipeline. So I've created my pipeline. In this case, I created it in Visual Studio, but you could equally do it in the browser. I deployed that, and it went off and it ran. You sometimes have to wait a little while if you specified a particular availability time for the data sets. You might have to wait that length of time until it's ready to run. And when it does run, it will go ahead and copy that data across.